in the gentle folds of the English countryside, where hedgerows stitched together green fields like careful embroidery and the church bells marked time with unhurried dignity, lay the village of St. Mary Mead. It was a place accustomed to tranquility, to polite nods exchanged over garden gates, and to the mild excitements of church fetes and jam-making competitions. Scandal, when it came, usually concerned an overgrown rosebed or a trespassing hen. The heart of St. Mary Mead's social life was Gossington Hall, the gracious home of Colonel and Mrs. Bantry. The hall stood back from the lane behind wrought-iron gates and a sweep of gravel drive, its mellow stone warmed by decades of summer suns. Inside, polished oak floors gleamed beneath Persian rugs, and portraits of solemn ancestors surveyed visitors with tolerant disdain. Mrs. Daly Bantry, with her lively eyes and cheerful frankness, was very much the spirit of the place. She possessed an unquenchable appetite for gossip, not from malice, but from a sincere delight in the drama of ordinary lives. If St. Mary Mead had a pulse, Dolly felt it first. On a mild April morning, the peace of Gossington Hall was disturbed by a motor car crunching up the drive at an hour when callers were neither expected nor desired. Dolly, who was in the morning room arranging tulips in a blue Delft vase, glanced up in mild irritation. "Arthur," she called to husband, the retired Colonel Bantry, who was perusing the Times with military solemnity. "We're invaded." Colonel Bantry peered over his spectacles. "Tradesman? I fear not. It has the air of authority." Her instinct proved correct. Moments later, the parlour-maid admitted Inspector Slack, accompanied by a younger man in plain clothes. Inspector Slack, a solid figure with an earnest expression, removed his hat and cleared his throat. "Miss Bantry, I'm sorry to trouble you, but I must ask you to accompany us to Much Benham Dock Company you?" Dolly repeated, her voice rising slightly. "For what purpose?" "There has been an incident," said Slack carefully. "Your name has arisen in connection with it." Colonel Bantry rose at once. "Surely you don't imply I imply nothing, Colonel," Slack replied stiffly. "Only that Mrs. Bantry's presence is required." Dolly felt a curious chill. Incidents did not generally require one's presence under police escort. Within the hour, she found herself seated in a small wood-panelled courtroom in Much Benham, facing a magistrate whose pince-nez trembled with disapproval. The charge, when it came, seemed too absurd to comprehend. She was accused of the murder of Mr. Edward Prothero. A murmur rippled through the sparse audience. Dolly's breath caught. Edward Prothero was no stranger. He had been a guest at Gossington Hall, scarcely 3 evenings earlier, attending a small dinner party given in honour of his engagement to Miss Clara Ellison, a charming young woman newly arrived in the district. Mr. Prothero had been found dead the following afternoon in the library at Gossington Hall. The cause, poisoning, and the instrument, a glass of port, served after dinner. Mrs. Bantry's hand trembled as she gripped her handbag. "This is monstrous," she whispered to Colonel Bantry. "I assure you, Mrs. Bantry," the magistrate intoned, "this is but a preliminary hearing. You are not yet formally charged. However, the evidence places you as the last person to have handled the decanter from which the deceased drank." Dolly felt the room tilt slightly. Yes, she had poured the port. It had been her own suggestion, an old bottle from the cellar, declared by the Colonel to be a treasure. Edward Prothero had raised his glass in a jovial toast. "To hospitality," he had said. By the following afternoon he was dead. News travels swiftly in a village. By tea-time, St. Mary Mead buzzed like an overstirred hive. At the vicarage, Miss Jane Marple listened quietly as the vicar's wife recounted the events with breathless detail. "It's too dreadful," Mrs. Price Ridley declared. "Poor Dolly! And in her own house!" Miss Marple, seated with her knitting in her lap, looked thoughtful rather than shocked. "My dear," she said gently, "when something appears too dreadful, it is often because it has been arranged to appear so." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "You don't think? I never think anything without proper evidence," Miss Marple replied mildly. But Dolly Bantry poisoning a guest at her own dinner table. "It reminds me very much of what happened to Miss Eyes Pritchard in Little Havisham in 2028. Everyone assumed," she broke off, smiling faintly. The vicar's wife leaned forward. "You don't believe she did it?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that human nature is remarkably consistent, and Dolly Bantry's nature does not include murder." That evening, Miss Marple walked slowly up the drive to Gossington Hall. The tulips still nodded innocently in the borders, unaware that their mistress stood under suspicion of capital crime. Inside, Dolly Bantry sat pale but composed. "Dane," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "They think I killed him." Miss Marple took her hand. "My dear Dolly, tell me everything." And as the fire crackled in the grate and shadows lengthened against the panelled walls, Dolly began her account of the dinner party that had ended in death. The guests had been few. Edward Prothero, his fiancée, Clara Ellison, Mr. Julian Markham, a distant cousin of Prothero's Dr. Basil Harcourt, a local physician, and Mrs. Lavinia Trent, a wealthy widow with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes. Conversation had been lively, though beneath it ran currents Dolly had only half perceived at the time. Julian Markham had seemed tense, his laughter too quick. Clara Ellison, pale but resolute, had watched Prothero with an intensity that now seemed almost anxious. Dr. Harcourt had been attentive, particularly when Prothero complained lightly of indigestion. "And Mrs. Trent?" Miss Marple asked softly. Dolly hesitated. "She is a female character in the video game." And Edward quarrelled briefly. "Something about investments." I couldn't quite hear. "And the port?" I fetched it myself. Arthur was boasting of it dreadfully. "I poured for the gentleman. Only the gentleman." "Yes." Clara declined. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "And Mr. Prothero's glass?" I handed it to him directly. There it was, the detail upon which the accusation rested. Miss Marple rose at last. "My dear Dolly," she said, "do not despair. Appearances are often designed to mislead. I believe this little matter will repay closer observation." Outside, the evening air lay cool and fragrant with damp earth. The hall's windows glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. Somewhere within those walls, Miss Marple felt certain, lay the truth not in dramatic gestures, but in small inconsistencies, in human nature, in the quiet habits of ordinary people. Lady Bantry in the dock? It was absurd. And absurdities, Miss Marple knew, were often the beginning of revelation. The following morning dawned pale and silvery, a thin mist clinging to the hedgerows like reluctant gossip. In St. Mary Mead, curiosity had ripened overnight into speculation of the most energetic kind. By 10 o'clock, at least 4 mutually contradictory accounts of Edward Prothero's last moments were circulating between the post office and the butcher's shop. Miss Marple, who understood better than most the value of village chatter, made her way first not to Gossington Hall but to the Blue Boar, where information tended to ferment quietly before achieving full-bodied flavour. She ordered tea and listened. "Terrible business," remarked Mr. Hinks, the grocer, leaning confidentially across a table. "I always said outsiders bring trouble. Prothero wasn't local." "No," agreed Mrs. Carter. "Though I heard he'd come into money. Quite a lot of it." Miss Marple's ears sharpened at that. Money, in her experience, was as dependable a motive as jealousy, and often rather more effective. She left shortly thereafter and walked towards Much Benham, where Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters. She was received with cautious politeness. "Miss Marple," said Slack, with the faint air of a man who suspects interference disguised as innocence, "I trust you've not come to obstruct official procedure." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "I've come to understand it." Slack sighed. "The facts are straightforward. Mr. Prothero was found dead in the library at Gossington Hall at approximately 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. He had returned there alone after luncheon to consult some documents." "What documents?" asked Miss Marple. "Financial papers. Apparently. There was correspondence on the desk. We've sent it for examination. And the cause of death, arsenic, administered in a concentrated form. It was present in his system in sufficient quantity to kill within hours. Arsenic," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very old-fashioned." Slack frowned. "It was in the port decanter." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "In the decanter itself?" "Yes." "Curious," she murmured. "And yet none of the other gentlemen fell ill?" Slack shifted. "They did not consume enough to prove fatal. She thanked him and departed, leaving behind a faint impression of pink wool and quiet calculation. Her next call was at the small cottage Clara Ellison had taken upon her engagement. Clara opened the door herself. She looked very young in the morning light, her fair hair pulled back severely, her eyes shadowed by grief or something akin to it. "Miss Marple, how kind! My dear child," Miss Marple said gently. "May I come in?" They sat in a neat sitting room that bore the unmistakable signs of recent occupation, unsettled ornaments, books not yet comfortably placed. "You were engaged to Mr. Prothero only recently?" Miss Marple asked. 6 weeks, Clara replied. It was all so sudden. Edward was decisive. "Darned happy?" Clara hesitated. "Yes, of course." Miss Marple noticed the faint tightening of her fingers. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity," she continued, "but were there any objections to the match?" Clara gave a brittle laugh. Julian disliked it. "Mr. Markham? Yes." Edward's cousin. They were raised almost as brothers. But Edward had control of the estate now. Julian depended on him financially. Indeed, Dot and Mrs. Trent. Miss Marple ventured. Clara's expression altered again, something sharper this time. She invested heavily with Edward I. "Believe there were losses." "Serious ones?" "I don't know. Edward wouldn't discuss business with me." Miss Marple nodded. "Tell me, my dear, did Mr. Prothero take any medicine?" "Yes, a tonic, for his digestion. Dr. Harcourt prescribed it. Clara rose suddenly and crossed to the mantelpiece. "They all suspect Miss Bantry, don't they?" "There are suspicions," Miss Marple admitted. Clara turned sharply. "It's absurd. Dolly Bantry is incapable of harm." "Quite," Miss Marple said quietly. Yet as she left the cottage, she reflected that Clara's defense had been swift, almost rehearsed. Julian Markham proved easier to locate. He was staying at the King's Arms in Much Benham and appeared distinctly irritated by the attention. "A dreadful misunderstanding," he said briskly, pacing the small sitting room. "My cousin had enemies, business rivals. But you were present at the dinner," Miss Marple reminded him. "Yes, and? So were others." "You were heard to argue." Julian flushed. "Family matters, concerning finances." He stopped pacing. Edward had promised me assistance. He was reconsidering. "I see. Surely you don't imply I imply nothing." Miss Marple echoed Inspector Slack's earlier phrase with gentle irony. Julian resumed his restless movement. "Edward was careless," he muttered. "He made enemies." "Did he?" "Yes, Mrs. Trent, for one. She lost a considerable sum. And you." He hesitated. "I stood to inherit," he said finally. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you for your candor." As she stepped outside, she reflected that desperation often left fingerprints more visible than poison. Dr. Basil Harcourt received her in his surgery with professional reserve. He was a man in his early 40s, handsome in a controlled, careful way. "Arsenic?" he repeated when she mentioned it. "Extraordinary. You prescribed Mr. Prothero a tonic, a mild digestive mixture, containing nothing remotely harmful. Arsenic symptoms resembled digestive distress, in small quantities, perhaps." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly on her lap. "And Mrs. Bantry?" she asked. "A delightful woman. Incapable of murder." "Quite," Miss Marple murmured, but she noted that his defense lacked Clara's fervor. Last, she visited Mrs. Lavinia Trent, who resided in a smart villa on the outskirts of the village. Mrs. Trent was elegant, cool, and unflustered. Edward was reckless, she said crisply. "I warned him. You lost Mummy. A temporary fluctuation. Were you angry?" "Of course I was angry. I am not a saint." "Did you quarrel at dinner?" "We discussed matters. He dismissed my concerns. And yet you drank no port. I prefer sherry." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So sensible." Mrs. Trent's eyes narrowed. "You suspect me?" "I observe everyone," Miss Marple replied. By evening the pieces lay scattered before her like a half-completed puzzle. Arsenic in the decanter. A quarrel over money. A dependent cousin. A concerned fiancé. A physician with access to substances. A widow nursing financial wounds. And Dolly Bantry, generous, impulsive Dolly, whose only crime had been hospitality. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching twilight settle over her small garden. "It is always the small things," she murmured. The dropped stitch, the overlooked habit. In the distance, Ossington Hall stood silent and dignified. But within its library, a man had died, and someone, Miss Marple felt certain, had arranged matters very carefully indeed. 3 days after Edward Prothero's death, St. Mary Mead had settled into that peculiar state of strained normality which follows scandal. The milk was still delivered, the church flowers still arranged, yet conversation faltered when certain names were spoken. At Gossington Hall, Dolly Bantry bore the strain with outward bravery. She received callers, endured sympathetic glances, and spoke firmly of her innocence. Yet, when alone, her composure frayed. "I keep seeing him raise that glass," she confided to Miss Marple one afternoon, laughing, and I handed it to him. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "if one were to avoid all actions that might later be twisted into significance, one should never hand anyone anything at all." Dolly managed a weak smile. "I cannot bear that they think I tampered with the port." "Let us consider that very carefully," Miss Marple replied. They sat in the library, the scene of the tragedy. The afternoon light slanted across the polished desk where Edward Prothero had been. Found, collapsed forward among his papers. Inspector Slack had described the position precisely. Prothero seated in the high-backed leather chair, head bowed, one hand resting on a sheaf of correspondence. The port decanter stood on a side table, half empty. "It is odd," Miss Marple murmured, rising to examine the cabinet where the decanter was usually kept. "You say the port was returned here after dinner?" "Yes," Dolly answered. "Arthur replaced it himself, and it remained undisturbed until the following afternoon, so far as I know." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the French windows. They stood closed now, but the latch bore faint scratches. Were these locked that night? Dolly hesitated. "I cannot swear to it. Arthur sometimes leaves them merely latched." Indeed. Miss Marple bent closer. "Inspector Slack believes the arsenic was introduced into the decanter itself." "Yes." "How very theatrical," Miss Marple said softly. Dolly stared. "Theatrical? My dear, arsenic in a shared decanter is a blunt instrument. It risks unintended casualties, you mean? If one wished to kill Mr. Prothero alone, one would not rely upon chance." Dolly sank into a chair. "Then someone intended to risk the others? Or intended us to believe so?" That same evening, a new development disturbed the uneasy calm. Julian Markham was discovered unconscious in his room at the King's Arms. The cause: violent gastric distress. The rumour spread before the doctor's motor car had cooled. "He's been poisoned too," whispered Mrs. Carter at the grocer's. Miss Marple, hearing the news from her maid, pursed her lips thoughtfully and set out at once. Dr. Harcourt was already in attendance when she arrived at the inn. Julian lay pale and sweating, his expression contorted with pain. "Food poisoning," Harcourt said briskly. "Undoubtedly, arsenic?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. Harcourt stiffened. "Certainly not, but the symptoms resemble many things," he snapped, then moderated his tone. "Forgive me. The atmosphere has become suggestive." Miss Marple regarded Julian carefully. The young man stirred faintly. "Water," he murmured hoarsely. Miss Marple noticed a glass on the bedside table. "Did he dine alone?" she asked. "Yes," the innkeeper said. "Cold beef and ale." "And no port?" she added lightly. The innkeeper shook his head vigorously. "No, miss." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The following morning, Julian was declared out of danger. It was nothing sinister, Dr. Harcourt insisted, merely spoiled meat. Yet the incident achieved its purpose. Suspicion flared anew. "If Julian was poisoned," Mrs. Price Ridley whispered anxiously to Miss Marple, "perhaps he knows something, or wishes us to think so," Miss Marple replied. A second twist followed swiftly. Inspector Slack summoned Miss Marple to Much Benham. "We've uncovered something," he announced. From an envelope, he produced a letter recovered from Prothero's desk. It was unsigned, but written in a feminine hand. "If you do not honor your promise, I shall be forced to act. You cannot silence me forever." Miss Marple read it twice. "Was it addressed?" "No, dated." 2 days before his death. Slack tapped the page. "Blackmail, perhaps." "Possibly," Miss Marple conceded. "Have you compared the handwriting?" "To whom?" "To Miss Ellison." "To Mrs. Trent?" Slack frowned. "We shall." Clara Ellison received the news with visible shock. "Blackmail. Edward. Impossible." "Are you certain?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara flushed. "He was not a dishonorable man." "Did he promise you anything? Something perhaps difficult to fulfill?" Clara's gaze flickered. "He intended to sell a portion of the estate," she said quietly, "to settle debts, investment losses." "And Mrs. Trent?" Clara looked away. She pressed him constantly. Miss Marple studied her face. "And you? Did you ever quarrel?" "Never." But the denial came too quickly. Mrs. Lavinia Trent proved more composed. "Blackmail," she repeated coolly. "Edward had many imprudent dealings." "Did you threaten him?" "I threatened to withdraw my remaining investments." "And the handwriting?" Mrs. Trent's smile was thin. "You may compare it if you wish." She offered several notes without hesitation. Miss Marple examined them later with care. The writing bore similarities, yet something was strained in the anonymous letter, as though deliberately disguised. That night, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, the letter spread before her. Beside her knitting. "Human beings," she murmured, "so often attempt to oversimplify their villainy. The arsenic in the decanter is too obvious. Julian's sudden illness too convenient. An anonymous threat almost melodramatic. She thought of Clara's pale intensity, Julian's restless desperation, Mrs. Trent's injured pride, Dr. Harcourt's professional composure. And then, something small returned to her memory. At the dinner table, Dolly had mentioned, Clara declined the port. Only the gentleman drank, yet Julian had consumed his glass and lived, unless Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air, unless Edward's glass had been different, a substitution, a single prepared glass placed where chance would direct it, and the decanter itself, merely contaminated afterward to support the illusion. Her gaze sharpened. Yes, that would explain much. But who had the opportunity? And why stage Julian's illness? Unless Julian himself wished to divert suspicion or draw it elsewhere. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh dear," she whispered. "Someone has tried rather too hard." Outside, the wind rustled the budding branches. Within the quiet cottage, threads of truth were slowly weaving together. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the killer, believing matters cleverly obscured, waited for the storm to pass. They had underestimated an elderly lady with a talent for observing human folly, and Miss Jane Marple was very nearly ready to pull the final thread. Miss Marple always maintained that revelations, like good puddings, required proper setting before they could be turned out neatly. One must not rush them, nor prod them prematurely, so she allowed 2 days to pass before making any decisive move, using that time to observe rather than question. It was in observation, after all, that the truth most frequently betrayed itself. During those 2 days, St. Mary Mead produced a fresh layer of small but telling details. Julian Markham recovered with suspicious rapidity. By the second afternoon he was strolling cautiously along the high street, pale but dramatically subdued, accepting condolences with grave dignity. Clara Ellison, by contrast, grew increasingly strained. She visited Gossington Hall daily, bringing flowers for Dolly and speaking earnestly of Edward's goodness. Yet, she avoided the library. Mrs. Lavinia Trent remained outwardly calm, but Miss Marple noticed she had written several urgent letters and dispatched them by registered post. Dr. Harcourt resumed his rounds with practiced serenity, though Miss Marple could not help observing that he now kept his medicine cabinet locked. And Inspector Slack, fortified by the anonymous letter and the arsenic in the decanter, prepared to recommend formal charges against Mrs. Bantry. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested a small gathering at Gossington Hall. Dolly, pale but resolute, agreed at once. "If it will clear my name, Jane, I shall endure anything." The invitations were delivered discreetly. Clara Ellison, Julian Markham, Mrs. Lavinia Trent, Dr. Harcourt, Inspector Slack. On the appointed evening, the drawing-room at Gossington Hall glowed with lamplight. The air held the faint scent of beeswax polish and early roses. The atmosphere, however, was brittle. Colonel Bantry stood stiffly by the fireplace. Dolly sat upright on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly. Inspector Slack looked faintly suspicious. Miss Marple entered last, carrying her knitting bag. "My dear friends," she began gently, "thank you for coming. I have asked you here because I believe the events of the past week have been misunderstood." Julian shifted in his chair. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, unless you possess new evidence so, I believe I do," she said mildly, though it may not resemble evidence in the usual sense. She turned to Dolly. "You poured the port yourself?" "Yes." "And handed a glass directly to Mr. Prothero?" "Yes." "Did you prepare the glasses beforehand?" "No. They were already set out on the sideboard." Miss Marple nodded. That is most important. She faced the group. You see, Inspector Slack's theory rests upon arsenic being placed in the decanter. But that presents a difficulty. What difficulty? Slack demanded. 3 gentlemen drank from it. Only 1 died. Slack shifted. The others may not have consumed sufficient quantity. Quite. But consider this. Arsenic in solution does not settle obediently at the bottom waiting for a particular victim. It disperses. Doctor. Harcourt inclined his head. That is correct. Therefore, Miss Marple continued, if the decanter were poisoned prior to dinner, we should expect at least 2 gentlemen to exhibit serious symptoms. Julian stiffened. Yet only Mr. Prothero suffered fatal consequences, and the decanter, we are told, still contained arsenic the following day. Precisely, said Slack, which suggests, Miss Marple said softly, that the arsenic was introduced after dinner. A silence fell. Mrs. Trent's fan snapped shut. After dinner? Clara repeated faintly. Yes. After Mr. Prothero retired to the library. Inspector Slack frowned. But why? To create the illusion that Mrs. Bantry poisoned her guest at table. Dolly gasped softly. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Let us consider the timeline. After dinner, Mr. Prothero excused himself to consult papers in the library. The others dispersed some to the drawing room, some outdoors. Julian swallowed. The library windows were not securely fastened. Anyone might have entered or left without immediate notice. Colonel Bantry muttered something under his breath. But how, Slack demanded, was the poison administered? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not in the decanter, in a single glass. Clara's breath caught. At some point before Mrs. Bantry poured the port, 1 glass was prepared. It contained a concentrated dose of arsenic, perhaps concealed beneath a small measure of wine already present. Dr. Harcourt's expression changed just slightly. Miss Bantry, unaware, poured port into each glass. The prepared glass was positioned for Mr. Prothero. Julian's face had gone grey. He drank, Miss Marple continued, and later, alone in the library, the poison took effect. Inspector Slack stared. And the decanter? After Mr. Prothero was discovered dead, the killer needed to divert suspicion. So arsenic was added to the remaining port in the decanter. Thus, when tested, it would confirm contamination. Dolly pressed a hand to her mouth. But who could have done such a thing? She whispered. Miss Marple turned slowly. Someone with knowledge of poisons. Someone with opportunity to approach both the sideboard before dinner and the decanter afterward. Someone whose later illness conveniently muddied the waters. Julian leapt to his feet. This is outrageous. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Your gastric distress, Mr. Markham, occurred shortly after it became known that arsenic was the cause of death. He flushed. It was spoiled meat, indeed. Yet Dr. Harcourt assures us it was not arsenic. Julian looked toward the doctor involuntarily. A tiny movement, but Miss Marple saw it. Your illness, she continued gently, served 2 purposes. It suggested that the poison was indiscriminate and it aroused sympathy. You cannot prove no, she said softly. But I can observe. She shifted her gaze to Dr. Harcourt. And you, doctor? You prescribed Mr. Prothero a digestive tonic. Yes, containing no arsenic, of course. Certainly not. But you had access to arsenic. He hesitated. In minute quantities, for legitimate purposes. Miss Marple nodded. Quite. And you were attentive to Mr. Prothero's complaints at dinner. Clara looked between them in dawning horror. No, she whispered. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Mr. Prothero had recently altered his will. Julian's composure cracked. You have no right, he intended, Miss Marple continued calmly, to marry Miss Ellison and secure her future. This would significantly reduce the allowance upon which you depended. Julian's hands clenched. And Mrs. Trent's investments had suffered. Prothero's financial misjudgments threatened exposure. Mrs. Trent rose sharply. I will not, please sit down, Miss Marple said quietly. Your anger was genuine, but not murderous. She turned back to Julian. You stood to gain most by Mr. Prothero's death. Julian's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. He ruined me, and so, Miss Marple said softly, you ruined him. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Markham! Julian's eyes darted wildly. It was Harcourt, he burst out. He supplied. Dr. Harcourt stood abruptly. This is madness. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Doctor, you were fond of Miss Ellison, were you not? Clara gasped. Harcourt's face drained of colour. You knew Prothero's health was fragile. You knew how to calculate dosage. And you confirmed publicly that Julian's illness was not arsenic. A terrible stillness filled the room. Julian laughed suddenly, a strained, broken sound. We planned nothing together, he said wildly. It was my idea. I prepared the glass. Harcourt merely ensured your symptoms would not contradict the narrative, Miss Marple finished quietly. Inspector Slack stepped between them. So it was you, Markham. Julian's shoulders sagged. Yes, he said at last. I put it in the glass. Before dinner. He never noticed. Clara began to weep softly. I loved her, Julian whispered brokenly, and he flaunted everything. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Mr. Markham. You loved what you believed you deserved. Inspector Slack signaled to the constable waiting outside. As Julian was led away, Dr. Harcourt sank into a chair, his composure shattered. You should have refused him, Miss Marple said quietly. Harcourt did not reply. The drawing room seemed suddenly larger, emptier. Dolly Bantry exhaled shakily. Jane, she whispered, you've saved me. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Dolly, I merely followed the thread. It was there all along. Outside, the night air lay calm over Gossington Hall. The truth, at last, had been turned out neatly from its mould. And St. Mary Mead would sleep easier, though perhaps not more wisely. In the days that followed the revelation at Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead passed through the familiar stages of shock, indignation, reflection, and inevitably adjustment. Julian Markham's confession, once formally recorded, travelled through the village with astonishing speed. By the time the Evening Post was delivered, even Mrs. Meakin's deaf tabby was rumoured to have heard the particulars. Inspector Slack returned to Much Benham with an expression of mingled satisfaction and mild chagrin. He did not relish having been corrected, however tactfully, by an elderly lady with knitting needles, yet the clarity of the solution was undeniable. Julian had admitted to preparing the poisoned glass before dinner. He had obtained arsenic through a pretext claiming to require rat poison for a property in disrepair. Dr. Harcourt, though not the instigator, had knowingly failed to question Julian's later illness with sufficient rigour. Whether that omission would result in formal censure remained to be seen. Edward Prothero's death, once clouded by theatrical misdirection, had been reduced to its plain human course. Resentment sharpened by dependency, envy hardened by wounded pride, and through it all, Dolly Bantry's name was cleared. The morning after Julian's arrest, Gossington Hall awoke to a curious sensation of lightness. Dolly, who had slept poorly for a week, came down to breakfast with renewed colour in her cheeks. I feel, she declared, as though someone has lifted a damp blanket off the entire house. Colonel Bantry folded his newspaper. Confounded fellow, he muttered. Sat at my table. Dolly shuddered slightly. It is dreadful to think of it, all the while smiling and asking for the salt. Miss Marple, who had been invited to breakfast in quiet celebration, stirred her tea. Smiles are very often the most convenient disguises, she observed gently. One sees it frequently in small domestic matters. Mrs. Durand, in the next parish, once borrowed sugar. Every Thursday with the sweetest expression imaginable. It transpired she had no intention of replacing it. Dolly stared at her for a moment and then laughed, the sound bubbling out in relief. Oh, Jane, you are incorrigible. I merely observe patterns, Miss Marple replied modestly. Clara Ellison's grief proved more complex. She called upon Miss Marple privately 2 days later, her eyes red but dry. I feel so foolish, she confessed. I thought Julian merely resentful. I never imagined, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. We cannot be held accountable for what we do not choose to see. Clara clasped her gloves tightly. Edward had faults, she admitted quietly. He was reckless with money, but he did not deserve this. No, Miss Marple agreed. There was a pause. And Dr. Harcourt? Clara asked in a low voice. Miss Marple regarded her gently. Dr. Harcourt allowed his personal feelings to cloud his professional judgment. That is always dangerous. Clara's cheeks coloured faintly. I did not encourage him, she said quickly. I am sure you did not. But admiration, when unreturned, can curdle into something most unfortunate. Clara rose. "I shall leave St. Mary Mead," she said with quiet resolve. "There is nothing for me here now." Miss Marple inclined her head. New beginnings can be most restorative. When Clara had gone, Miss Marple sat very still for some moments. Human hearts, she reflected, were far more fragile than crystal decanters and considerably more difficult to mend. Miss Lavinia Trent, meanwhile, displayed a brisk practicality that impressed even the vicar's wife. "I was angry," she admitted during a chance encounter at the post office. "But not homicidal, not quite," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Trent fixed her with a sharp glance. "You never truly suspected me?" "I never exclude anyone," Miss Marple replied serenely. Mrs. Trent gave a short laugh. "I believe that is why you succeed." A fortnight later, the matter of Edward Prothero's will was settled. With Julian disinherited by virtue of his crime, the estate passed according to its revised provisions. Charitable donations, modest annuities, and a portion for Clara, though she declined to remain in the district to enjoy it. St. Mary Mead gradually resumed its customary rhythms. The church fete proceeded, albeit with slightly subdued enthusiasm. Conversations returned to roses, weather, and the persistent unreliability of the butcher's scales. Yet something subtle had shifted. At the Blue Boar one evening, Mr. Hinks declared with conviction, "You never truly know what's going on behind a man's face." "Or a woman's," Mrs. Carter added pointedly. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, allowed herself a faint smile. One warm afternoon, she walked once more. Up the drive to Gossington Hall. The tulips had given way to early summer blooms, and the windows stood open to admit the scent of cut grass. Dolly met her at the door. "Jane, I was just thinking of you." "Dangerous habit," Miss Marple replied lightly. They settled in the drawing-room with tea served in thin porcelain cups. "I keep wondering," Dolly said thoughtfully, "whether there was anything I might have noticed." Miss Marple considered this. "You noticed quite a great deal," she said at last. "You observed tension. You recalled who declined port. You remember the arrangement of the glasses, but I did not see the danger." "Danger," Miss Marple said gently. "It is rarely obliging enough to announce itself." Dolly stirred her tea absently. "Julian seemed so normal." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but he was a man accustomed to comfort without effort. When that comfort was threatened, resentment bloomed." She paused. "It is rather like certain climbing roses. Left unchecked, they entangle everything in their path." Dolly laughed softly. "Trust you to compare murder with gardening, my dear," said Miss Marple. "Both require patience and pruning." They sat in companionable silence for a while. At length, Dolly reached across and squeezed her friend's hand. "I shall never forget what you have done for me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Nonsense. I merely dislike injustice, and I should have found it most inconvenient if my dearest friend were hanged." Dolly gasped. "Jane!" "Miss." Marple allowed herself a demure smile. One must consider practicalities. As the sun dipped lower over St. Mary Mead, casting long golden shadows across the lawns of Gossington Hall, Miss Marple made her unhurried way home. The village lay peaceful once more. Children's laughter drifted from the green. A bicycle bell chimed in the distance. The ordinary reassuring sounds of life. Yet Miss Marple knew us. She always did that beneath the calm surfaces of human existence, lay currents capable of unexpected turbulence. Edward Prothero's death had not been the work of melodrama or grand conspiracy. It had arisen from something smaller, sadder, and infinitely more common, the quiet conviction that one is entitled to what belongs to another. And so, she reflected, the solution had not been hidden in chemistry or cunning alone, but in character. Human nature did not alter simply because the setting was picturesque or the manners polite. It remained stubbornly itself flawed, hopeful, jealous, affectionate. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to examine a rosebud just beginning to unfurl. "Appearances," she murmured softly, "are most persuasive when carefully arranged." Behind her, St. Mary Mead rested in the golden hush of early evening. Its scandal concluded, its equilibrium restored. And somewhere, in a quiet cell far from the hedgerows and church bells, Julian Markham confronted the consequences of a single carefully prepared glass. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her gardening gloves and went indoors for supper. There would no doubt be other mysteries in time, but for now Lady Bantry stood vindicated. The village breathed again, and order delicate, imperfect, yet resilient had been restored.